Okay, I think I'll make I'll make some statements about Nietzsche and the indefensible side of some of the things that he says, and I actually think Nietzsche knew this. He talks a lot about not wanting to be followed, trying to break down. He doesn't want it to be possible to turn his philosophy into a metaphysical dictum, and I think this is his true accomplishment as a writer. Of course, and the result is there's all these various I don't know, just made up shit. Like the Nazis using him when he said how he praised the Jewish people, and yet the Nazis are going to use him. It's just like, in the long run, you could see they were exploiting something. There was no reality to it. But he does make himself, Nietzsche, that is prone to this sort of thing. So I'll talk about that later. But the reason it's a separate issue is because the value of Nietzsche is in his analytical ability to break down concepts and describe how he does that. He incorporates multiple sides. There's a balance to points. There's podes and antipodes. There's, it's like he could criticize Christianity and then say, oh, but it was necessary historically or whatever. And this confuses people, but is also a value of his. But even if none of that was of value, just his knowledge of how the concepts have evolved for thousands of years in the West, and his own take on that makes for useful tricks of analysis. In the end, he's the kind of philosopher that doesn't mean you go, I'm a Nietzsche and everything he said. It's not like that. It's not how it works. I don't think people should be lionized that way. Certainly not Nietzsche. But there are some interesting concepts in here. And some are fundamental and long-ranging, like Christianity is Platonism for the masses. Okay, that can help you figure out what's going on in your society. Figuring out what's, like, for example, in Christian apologetics, realizing that Christianity is Platonism for the masses, you understand that you can use anti-Platonic arguments when you're arguing Christian apologetics that are presuppositional, specifically. That's what I was thinking of there. Okay, aphorism 12. Also, I try to change my voice such that when I'm reading versus my commentary, because I'm interspersing commentary. But what else is the point here? I mean, this isn't a book on tape. Friedrich Nietzsche reading his own book so you can listen to him unadulterated in the car. I'm commenting on him. If you want to check yourself, you can go, and I'm using the Walter Kaufman translation, a book I've had, 25 years, I guess, at least. A Prelude to Philosophy of the Future. This is aphorism 12. He wrote in little aphorisms. They're often, sometimes super tiny, but often, I don't know, they go a page or two or a half a page or whatever. Evidence is he worked quite hard in this aphorism, the size that they seem unrelated, but really there's a score to it. Okay, aphorism 12. Spend an extra minute describing almost nothing. Okay, here we go. You guys ready? I didn't want to rush you. As for materialistic atomism, right, the idea that there's one atomism and materialism. There's logical atomism, which is related but also separate and distinct from material atomism, the theory that things would break down to atoms. As for materialistic atomism, it is one of the best refuted theories there are, and in Europe perhaps no one in the learned world is now so unscholarly as to attach serious significance to it, except for convenient household use, as an abbreviation of a means of expression. Thanks chiefly to the Dalmatian Boscovich, he and the Pole Copernicus have been the greatest and most successful opponents of visual evidence so far. For while Copernicus has persuaded us to believe, contrary to all senses, that the earth does not stand fast, Boscovich has taught us to abjure the belief in the last part of the earth that stood fast, the belief in substance, in matter, in the earth residuum and particle atom. It is the greatest triumph over the senses that has been gained on earth so far. One must, however, still go further and also declare war, relentless war unto death against the atomistic need, which still leads a dangerous afterlife in places where no one suspects it, just like the more celebrated metaphysical need. One must also, first of all, give the finishing stroke to that other and more calamitous atomism, which Christianity has taught best and longest, the soul atomism. So, whether you believe in God or not, spirits or gods, is less important, I think, than whether you believe in soul atomism. Let it be permitted to designate by this expression the belief which regards the soul as something indestructible, eternal, indivisible, as a monad, as an atomon. This belief ought to be expelled from science. Between ourselves, we whose wakefulness is our sole responsibility, it is not at all necessary to get rid of the soul at the same time, and thus to renounce one of the most ancient and venerable hypotheses, as happens frequently to clumsy naturalists who can hardly touch on, quote-unquote, the soul without immediately losing it. But the way is open for new versions and refinements of the soul hypothesis. And such conceptions as mortal soul and, quote, the soul as subjective multiplicity, and soul as the social structure of the drives and affects, want henceforth to have citizens' rights in science. Okay, let's review that real quick. Quote unquote, a mortal soul. The concept of a mortal soul is useful. I totally believe that, and that is when I use the word soul. I think the word soul, used by people that believe in a metaphysical soul, there is no metaphysical soul. What are they referring to when they're referring to anything at all? They're probably lionizing, glorifying the mortal soul, which is this experience of mind and not a metaphysical thing. But it's still a thing because we do have this illusion of identity, right? And that illusion of identity exists, and through that illusion we can find out that it's an illusion and find out a lot of truths, even about its own inherent nature as sort of illusory. You know, we know this oneness has to be an illusion in some sense, where we're curious as to what grain of truth there is, and which is the same question as what unites that network so that it can harbor that illusion. He also says the soul as a subjective multiplicity. I believe that. I totally believe in the psychology described here, that our psychology is best modeled by us on the inside as a society of competing and contradictory potentially voices, as in a society. It could be uniform, it could be that there's divisions, it could be civil war, it could be conformity. Just as in a society, all of those are possible. And what we consider our ego and feeling of selfness is really a society of voices that we hear all of these voices. And the unity is thus more like a society, a unification of various voices, and the drives and affects. Affects, as Nietzsche uses the term, affects. So drives kind of are affects. Affects are maybe truly fundamental ones. They give psychological energy. They react to the environment, and you have to deal with the received sensation from a given affect. It has character, and you can describe it as a drive and ascertain, or in Nietzsche's system, it might even state its philosophy, which will then try to become the dominant philosophy, at least by default, at least if you have a society that's a meritocracy for domineering drives, which is the situation. All right. Continuing, finishing aphorism 12. When the new psychologist puts an end to the superstitions which have so far flourished with almost tropical luxuriance around the idea of the soul, he practically exiles himself into a new desert and a new suspicion. It is possible that the older psychologists had a merrier and more comfortable time of it. Eventually, however, he finds that precisely thereby he also condemns himself to invention, and who knows, perhaps to discovery. He was playing in the previous aphorisms on the difference between discovery and invention. faculties and mere naming. Okay. Aphorism 13. Physiologists should think before putting down the instinct of self-preservation as the cardinal instinct of an organic being. And he doesn't mean putting down, he means, signing that this instinct is the cardinal instinct. A living thing seeks above all to discharge its strength. Life itself is will to power. Self-preservation is only one of the indirect and most frequent results. This is kind of what Greatix is pointing at. Yeah, we can see the causal relationship, but really what we're dealing with is a will to power and comfort, and all of this happens to result in actions towards our survival. Often, not always. And greed really is an interesting case of that process. In short, here as everywhere else, let us beware of superfluous teleological principles of what the purpose of something is. One of which is the instinct of self-preservation. We owe it to Spinoza's inconsistency. Thus, method, which must be essentially economy of principles, demands it. Thus, method, which must essentially be economy of principles, demands it. So, economy of principles, Occam's razor. All right. See, I think I'd like to do 14 and 15, and I'll be able to start with 16, which I just love. Aphorism 16. Okay, it was life-changing to me. I think the first time I read it, but maybe it was one of the later times. I don't know. Okay, it is perhaps just dawning on 5 or 6 minds that physics, too, is only an interpretation and exegesis of the world to suit us, if I may say so, us, who are we, and not a world explanation. But insofar as it is based on belief in the senses, it is regarded as more, and for a long time to come must be regarded as more, namely, as an explanation. So we have to take science as an explanation, but it's not really, but it'll be a while till we realize it's not an explanation, and we can get in other words, for it to be productive at that time, and I think we're still more or less in that time, but of course more and more people probably realize that it could play its role, whatever it is, without pretending we've got explanations in science of why, or an essential understanding of it, when we really have descriptions of behavior acting as explanations. Okay, they act well as explanations, and for some periods of time and some purposes, that could be good enough, or at least what is necessary or unavoidable from the situation. Eyes and fingers speak in its favor. Visual evidence and palpableness do too. This strikes an age with fundamentally plebeian tastes as fascinating, persuasive, and convincing. After all, it follows instinctively the canon of truth of eternally popular sensualism. What is clear? What is explained? Only what can be seen and felt. Every problem has to be pursued to that point. Conversely, the charm of the Platonic way of thinking, which was a noble way of thinking, consisted precisely in resistance to obvious self-evidence. Perhaps among men who enjoy even stronger and more demanding senses than our contemporaries, but who knew how to find a higher triumph in remaining masters of their senses, and this by means of pale, cold, gray concepts, concept nets, which they threw over the motley whirl of the senses, the mob of the senses, as Plato said. Okay, this is interesting, because notice he calls Plato's way of thinking noble. And a lot of people then read him and he goes, oh, that's the noble way of thinking. Right, but he has huge parts where he talks about where nobility came from, in the history of good and evil, and how good and bad versus good and evil in their etymological and philosophical history. He says the noble people, they were barbarians. And they wanted to think they were better, and that's where this concept of nobility came from. It's the barbarians, it's not the intellectuals. It's the values of the barbarians, and then rarefied through multiple generations and distance from what attained them that power originally, and sort of a psychological issue where they interpret in crazy self-serving ways what's going on to sustain their position, say, of being royalty or noble. So when he says that it's noble, he's making a comment on this history of savagery that he exposits in other places, and I forget where, and if he gets into it in Beyond Good and Evil. So So that's interesting. Okay, he criticizes Plato a lot. He says Plato is Christianity's Platonism for the masses. He criticizes Christianity a lot, but then he calls it noble. People find that kind of speaking confusing. Okay. Finishing aphorism 14. In this overcoming of the world and interpreting of the world in the manner of Plato, there was an enjoyment different from that which the physicists of today offer us, and also the Darwinists and the anti-teleologists among the workers in physics and physiology, with their principles of the smallest possible force and the greatest possible stupidity. Quote, where man cannot find anything to see or to grasp, he has no further business, end quote. That is certainly an imperative different from the Platonic one, but it may be the right imperative for a tough, industrious race of machinists and bridge builders of the future who have nothing but rough work to do. So we're in the middle of that, or we're at the end of that. Was he right about? Of course, it wasn't a huge amount of prognostication to imagine a continuation of industrial spirit in what was it, 1886? Yeah. Okay, aphorism 15, last one for now. To study physiology with a clear conscience, one must insist that the sense organs are not phenomena in the sense of idealistic philosophy. As such, okay, to study physiology with a clear conscience, one must insist that the sense organs are not phenomena in the sense of idealistic philosophy. As such, they could not be causes. Sensualism, therefore, at least has a regulative hypothesis, if not a heuristic principle. What? And others even say that the external world is the work of our organs, but then our body, as part of this external world, would be the work of our organs. But then our organs themselves would be the work of our organs. It seems to me that this is a complete reductio ad absurdum. Assuming that the concept of a causa sui is something fundamentally absurd. Consequently, the external world is not the work of our organs, ? Well, he knows this is a weak argument, and people like Thou Art That could easily refute this because by saying it's not the work of our organs, but then where do we get our perceptions? They seem to come from organs. They're really fundamental. There's definitely ways out of this, but he's grasping at his take on something with multiple takes. And I happen to agree with this. I think if you use your senses to see things that seem to be like, I use my eyes to figure out it looks like my eyes are giving visual information to my brain, it does become more difficult to go, well, the eyes aren't really involved. It's just, why that self-explanation? Why does that self-explanation work out? Why does there have to be an explanation? Why, when I look at my eyes, don't I just find something connected to a dream world? Or did I find something connected to a dream world? It's photons, timeless particles of energy shooting into our eye and having quantum effects, and that's our vision. How do you get information in the Matrix? Is it different from that? What about in the dream world? What about when you're in the Buddha's dream and the whole world is a Buddha's dream, and how we get information then? Why do we have to have the physical thing, or is the physical thing just the dream mechanism? All right, cheers.